Good evening, Commissioners. Frank DiGiulianardo, Centerville, Maryland, here to request that you approve Ordinance 2403, which I understand will tighten up on the application and review and approval for these pier extensions beyond the normal 150 feet or so. It seemed to be, I don't really have statistics on this, but there seems to have been a proliferation of these longer piers of late in the county. And, I think a tighter review of those applications is in order. I appreciate Commissioner Corsiani for introducing this. One of the problems is that these excessively long piers can interfere with the general public use of our waterways. Sailing, kayaking, which tends to go, along the coastline for the most part, paddle boarding, and almost any kind of boating potentially can have a problem with these piers. Another aspect of the piers is that, the longer the pier, the more of the underwater environment is covered up and essentially put out of business in terms of habitat. So, the shorter the pier, the better. Finally, these piers tend to degrade our scenic waterways. Obviously, they're needed for practical purposes, but we don't need to have these private piers becoming marina-like. I think just a tighter review of this is in order. So I, again, request that you approve this ordinance.
I'm Jim Wright, Centerville, Maryland. I and my wife have lived on the Corsica River for over 40 years, and I and my family have lived in Queen Anne's County for a lot longer than that. And I'm here in support of this bill that will, as Frank has said, toughen the requirements allowed to expand a pier over the 150-foot length of right. I think this bill corrects probably either a mistake or a change of events. To my knowledge, this is the only conditional use that affects property not owned by the applicant. It's not a side yard, it's not a this or that. That property is owned by the state of Maryland for the benefit of the residents of the state of Maryland. And I would think that in that situation where it's being an application is for not property the applicant owns, but for something owned by the state for the benefit of the residents, there should be a requirement that says that the burden of proof for this use, which will double the length of a pier, that burden of proof should be on the applicant who's seeking to use other people's property. And unlike the burden of proof that basically on a conditional use is on the opponents to have to prove that this is not an appropriate one. This change, these long piers, have really changed the nature of our waterways. When I was a younger man, the size of boats were probably rowboats in 1940. They got to be sailboats, penguins. Then they became fishing boats, 15-foot fishing boats. I think now the larger boats that I see on the waterways are 30-foot boats. I call those big boats. These long piers are not for big boats. These long piers are for yachts. And I think that in that situation, particularly in the situations that the applicant has adequate water already, a lot of times on 150 foot, but they want a larger, deeper access for larger boats. They should have to prove the need for that requirement. Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. Jay Falstead, Queen Anne's Conservation Association. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. We urge you to vote favorably on Ordinance 2403. A couple things I'll say about this. It's hard to top anything that Mr. Wright just said, but he's absolutely right that the property that we're talking about, as these images show, as you look at each one of those properties, that ownership stops at the shoreline. And so it's not unreasonable to ask a landowner to have a little bit higher burden when requesting these long piers. What this is really about, and I say this having been on the losing end of conditional use applications in the past, but anytime a conditional use application comes in, that is a use, and it will be granted in almost every circumstance. You have to show that there's something just extraordinarily unique in order to deny a conditional use application. What 2403 says, it's not denying anybody the ability to go for a longer pier. It's just there's a little bit higher of a standard. And so I think it's not unreasonable for you all to request that higher standard. One of the Planning Commission members said at the last Planning Commission meeting that inconvenience does not constitute hardship. And I've been thinking about that because that's basically what we're talking about here. We're talking about long piers where somebody wants to put in a giant boat. Queen Anne's County has marinas for that. I think there's 7 of them in Queen Anne's County able to accommodate these large yachts. I fear that if we allow these extended piers to go on further, we're going to look like Barnegat Bay, New Jersey, or Tampa Bay, Florida, where you have these long piers going out, and it really creates a gigantic eyesore. And if we allow that to happen, we're really going to regret it in the long run. So I'll close by saying that we urge you to vote favorably on 2403, and thank you very much for the time.
I'm here really for one reason only. I actually have a application in for a conditional use next Wednesday. I've got a client who's been working for months to get that application heard, and my fear is that should you pass this bill 2 weeks from now, I can't possibly get it approved. I mean, it's going to be a race against time, between getting the bill approved and me getting construction underway. And I think it's patently unfair. The bill was introduced in January. My client had this application long before that. So what I'd like to ask is that you provide a grandfathering provision in the bill to recognize that he did file ahead of time. He did what the ordinance asked him to do. And it seems like it's pulling the rug out from under him to come in now and do this. Because even if I get the approval next Wednesday, your bill will trump that approval. Because once a new law comes into effect, there's not going to be any vesting because it can't possibly be under construction before the 45-day period and your bill becomes effective. So I just think in the interest of fairness that, the commissioners, you really ought to consider this grandfathering provision. I will say that there are other alternatives. I mean, you could have permitted use out to 150. You could have conditional use to, say, 250, and then beyond 250 have it that more strict standard of a variance. There is a huge difference between those requirements, meeting one standard versus meeting the other standard. And it's not just for yachts. There's a lot of shallow water, if you're on the wrong side of the river, then you need a longer pier in order to accommodate a boat, and they all aren't yachts. But thank you, and again, would really appreciate it if I don't know what I'm going to do, and next Wednesday I've got this hearing, not knowing what your vote's going to be, and I'm kind of left between a rock and a hard place. And I know staff was under the impression when I first talked to them that, well, we're in the queue, so you're okay, and we really aren't. Because if the law changes, we have to live with the new law. Thank you.